Hello and welcome to our program today, Wireless Devices, Health Dangers and Solutions with Beverly Rubik. Our program today is hosted by the Marin Chapter of the Weston A Price Foundation. Weston A Price Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to disseminating the research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price through education, research, and activism. Dr. Price's studies of isolated, non-industrialized peoples demonstrated that humans achieve perfect physical form and perfect health generation after generation only when they consume nutrient-dense whole foods and vital fat-soluble elements found exclusively in animal fats. The Marin Chapter of the Weston A Price Foundation holds monthly meetings to promote community, education, and fun. To find out more, go to westonaprice.org. Now I'll tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Beverly Rubik received her PhD in biophysics in 1979 at the University of California at Berkeley. Her scientific areas of interest include consciousness studies, bioelectromagnetics, water in regard to the living state, and the scientific base of alternative and complementary medicine. Dr. Rubik is especially known for her pioneering research on the biofield, the energy field associated with living organisms. She has also conducted studies on the effects of low-level electromagnetic fields on water and biological systems, and discovered an effect of cell phone radiation on human blood. Dr. Rubik has published 90 scientific papers and 2 books. She presently serves on the editorial boards of 4 peer-reviewed journals. Rubik was one of 18 U.S. congressionally appointed members of the Program Advisory Board to the Office of Alternative Medicine at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIH, from 1992 to 1997, and chaired the NIH panels on bioelectromagnetic medicine and energy healing. In 1996, Dr. Rubik founded the Institute for Frontier Science, or IFS, a nonprofit laboratory with the support from Lawrence S. Rockefeller Sr. To continue her work, and then relocated it to California. In 2002, IFS was awarded an NIH Center grant for frontier medicine research on biofield science in consortium with researchers at the University of Arizona. Current research at IFS is focused on detecting new elements of the human biofield. Dr. Rubik is a professor at Energy Medicine University, an adjunct professor at California Institute of Integral Studies, as well as Saybrook University, where she mentors master's and doctoral students. She's a popular speaker both nationally and internationally on topics in frontier science and medicine. And with that, let me introduce you to Dr. Beverly Rubik.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here and talk about a subject that I feel very passionate about, and you'll see what I mean. Cell phone use. It's become the dominant consumer wireless way of communicating worldwide. 7 billion cell phones, about 5 billion in developing countries, and now some 90% of American adults in the United States have cell phones. And 64% of these are smartphones, which emit even more radiation than the old flip-top cell phones. About half the children worldwide have access now to cell phones. And as I said, it's our main communication device. It's wireless and it's an emitter. It's emitting microwave radiation. Are cell phones safe? Well, actually, we don't have safety standards. It's quite interesting. We have what are called guidelines. Guidelines are terms in which we think are safe, but safety has never really been adequately measured on these products, and certainly they've not been around long enough to know if they're really safe. There are issues when you talk about safety. How old is the person? Are they pregnant? How many years of exposure? Because like other forms of radiation, the dosage is cumulative. As with x-rays, if you were going to go and get an x-ray of your lungs every 6 months, you might get lung cancer. We know that. And people who are doing x-ray, for example, in dentistry, they go hide behind a lead wall when you're getting radiated. So we know that radiation can have health consequences. So what about this microwave radiation? It's different from x-rays. That's the question. How are the phones used and stored in the body? As you'll see in my study, wearing a cell phone in a pocket or a backpack showed some rather deleterious changes on the blood. And we don't know our individual dosage. We're not running around with dosimeters as people do in the X-ray or medical use of ionizing ray industry. we don't have dosimeters freely distributed. We don't know our dose. And we know that doses of radiation are cumulative. So there's a big unknown here. And long-term exposure data has not yet been collected. So it's really a complex question with no consensus. If you'd like to know more about cell phone safety, I highly recommend videos and writings by Dr. Barry Trower. He's a retired physicist who explored this area some years ago, and he has videos and writings that you'll find on the web. Now, let's take a look at the history of evolution of Wi-Fi and other wireless technology in our lives. Personal computers first came out in 1997, and they were strictly wired. There was no internet yet, but broadband started in 1992. Coming from DARPA, largely the internet was born. In 1996, cell phones and towers appeared in addition to broadband. In 1998, we had low-orbit satellites that also contributed to this wireless radiation to which we're exposed. In 2001, Wi-Fi was introduced into our world. And in 2007, just about a decade ago, smartphones with their enormous capabilities, not just for making phone calls, but for really a million different applications. The sky's the limit. New apps are coming out every day, and the phones are very handy, and virtually everyone wants and uses a phone on a daily basis. So we're talking about radiation emanated from these cell phones and the Wi-Fi and cell phone towers that's in a particular region of this electromagnetic spectrum, which is really the chart of all the radiant energies in the universe that we understand. Going from the left-hand side, I'm talking about the extremely low frequency radiations, which are well known to come out of our brains and our heart and be associated with our biology, then on to radio waves, broadcast frequencies, and microwaves, which are used in cell phone communications, and terahertz, which is used in Homeland Security at the airport when you do this in that special machine, and they're looking for metals and things. So all of that is in the non-ionizing region of the spectrum. And for a long time, it was thought that non-ionizing radiation was harmless, except where it was intense enough to cause possible tissue heating or cooking, much as when you put food in a microwave and you turn it on, the food gets hot. We know that microwaves are absorbed by water and certain organic constituents, such as biochemicals in us. But at very low levels, is there an issue? That's the question. And just to further explain this spectrum, infrared is something the body emits. It's also non-ionizing. And then we have the tiny spectrum of visible light to which our eyes are sensitive. Now we start the ionizing radiations, including light, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma rays. And we know that there are dire consequences of ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma rays, and they're used in medicine very carefully to make images or to kill cancer cells. But other than that, we understand that we should not be exposed to radiation. So, but we know well that the mechanism of action of the ionizing rays, the ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma rays, are creating damage to our DNA, free radical chemistry, a host of biochemical changes. But what is going on in the non-ionizing part of that spectrum, where the microwave, the radio frequencies are, where all of the Wi-Fi devices in our lives are now utilizing that band? So the microwaves range between 300 megahertz and 3 gigahertz, and there are very specific cell phone radiation frequencies, such as 850, 900, 1800, and 1900 megahertz. And the frequencies are slightly different in other parts of the world, but indeed our cell phones work just fine when we take them around the world. So there's not a lot of difference there. I should point out that, it's not just about the frequencies per se. It's the fact that we're using digital devices that have extremely sharp bursts of radiation. So these things are not like analog devices where the power ramps up slowly, and if you pull the plug, ramps down. These devices are going in huge on and off arrays of bursts, which are sometimes nanoseconds long, extremely short. But that is extremely disruptive to the living system. If you have a continuous stimulus, if it's a sound or a magnetic field, your body adapts. But when you have something that's going on and off all the time and in a regular way, it's extremely jarring to living systems. That's what we're talking about here. So we have guidelines that are based on something completely different, not the burst structure, not the frequencies per se, but something called the specific absorption rate, or SAR. How do they measure this? They have this mannequin that really has head and shoulders. It's a hollow plastic dummy filled with physiological saline, salt solution, and water. And they have a thermometer in there, and they have a cell phone perched on what would be the head of the person, this dummy, and they're looking for temperature increases deep inside the salt water solution of the dummy. And if there are increases in temperature, then that's too much radiation. That's how they're measuring it. It's solely based on heating effects and nothing more. But as you'll see in a moment, there's a lot more to this. They're not taking into account what we call non-thermal effects. That means the non-heating effects, of which there are a host of biological effects. And I would say that the Russians have pioneered this for far longer than in the West. They know something that we don't know because their guidelines for exposure are 100 times lower than in the United States. In Austria, we found out that the microwave exposure from cell phones is 1,000 times less than what we have in the United States. So there's quite a discrepancy, but we have some of the highest radiation from our cell phones and our cell phone towers and modems in the world. The official view on safety is that, as I said, that radio waves and microwaves only have effects on living things if they heat them up, essentially cooking tissue or heating the water in us. And the cell phone radiation is really too weak to do this. So it's not about the specific absorption rate, even though that's what's officially measured and used as a guideline. And that guideline is the phone output is not to exceed 1.6 watts per kilogram. That's the dose of radiation that we can get from our cell phones. However, to take a look at the websites of our Food and Drug Administration and Federal Communications Commission, and you'll find this sentence: there is no proof, however, that wireless phones are completely safe. So sources of authority in the United States are admitting they are not certain about safety issues. Now, thermography has been used to show temperature changes in living things. And this is an image of a person, side view, the head, before exposure to cell phone radiation and immediately after a 15-minute phone call. Now, of course, we're looking really at the superficial parts of the head, and you see the ear and jaw area where the phone had been placed is a little bit warmer than the surrounding tissue. So there are heating effects. How far do they penetrate into the brain? Because it's really not so much of a problem, the external tissues of the body. So if we look deeper into the brain and calculate what would be the temperature changes, we find it depends on the age of the person. Because 5-year-olds have a very thin skull compared to adults, the radiation will penetrate more deeply and heat the brain. So as shown here, you get heating effects that span through even half the brain. The 10-year-old, not quite as great, and the adult, there's less penetration of these rays. All of this has to do with the fact that adults have thicker skulls than youngsters. How thick? Well, the 5-year-old, the skull thickness is only 0.5 millimeter. It doesn't block as much of the radiation. In the 10-year-old, it's 1 millimeter, very small amount, and in the adult, 2 millimeters. So it shows you how much the attenuation is just due to your skull bone. So children really are much more at risk for using cell phones, especially placing them next to the ear and head. And yet, frequently we see children doing this, as we see adults, and there are issues with this. So children are getting a dose that is really not safe, even by the standards in the United States today. So, radio frequency and exposure guidelines, as I said, in the United States, these are based solely on heating effects, and they don't take into account non-thermal biological effects. And as I said, in Russia, they have 100 times lower radiation with their cell phones. Why? Because the Russians pioneered effects of the biological effects that go beyond thermal effects on biological systems. They know a lot. And most of the papers in this area have come from outside of the United States. The research documenting biological effects that are not thermal of microwaves and other communication band frequencies. And there are a wide range of effects that have been documented, from behavioral and performance changes in people, to gene expression, to breaks in the DNA, to changes in blood-brain flow, and what is called the blood-brain barrier. There is a barrier to chemicals getting into the brain. If they're over a certain molecular weight, there's a barrier that prevents them from getting into the brain, which might cause changes in performance, behavior, and consciousness. That barrier is disrupted by cell phone radiation, by holding cell phones to the head within just a few minutes. And that's an important thing. It's not about heating so much as changing this blood-brain barrier and allowing chemicals that normally do not get into the brain from entering the brain and having a biological effect that's certainly more dangerous. There's documented effects on sperm count and motility. And of course, when sperm count and sperm motility go down, then fertility goes down. And it's not surprising then that we see an uprising of so many fertility clinics in the United States that simply were not there decades ago before we had all of these wireless devices. Now, there's something interesting from bioelectromagnetics, and that is there is a window of effect. Sometimes a less intense field actually can have a stronger non-thermal biological effect. It's somewhat paradoxical that this is the case, but there are windows of intensity, frequency that are active, and nobody really has a good theory for why this is so. We only have what we call empirical evidence, evidence that was gathered from laboratory studies or from epidemiology, from looking at people in the field. And we don't know why this is so. There is no good theory yet in bioelectromagnetics about biological effects that are not thermal. And consequently, the studies are also hard to replicate, in part because some scientists do not report all of their variables as carefully as they should. So then somebody else comes along and tries to replicate it and doesn't find exactly the same result. And I might mention something else, that there's quite a discrepancy between the literature that's been funded by the industry, that is the wireless device industry, and third-party research. The studies funded by the industry tend to see very few or little effects that are biological and non-thermal. And the studies funded by the third parties from outside the industry are actually showing more biological effects. So there seems to be a double standard. And very possibly the studies funded by the industry are biased. So there is a lot of disparate data in this area. And unfortunately, there's no unifying theory about the health impacts. And we simply need a lot more research to really understand what's going on. Epidemiology also tells us something about what's happening in this area. Since cell phones were introduced, we see certain new diseases like acoustic neuromas, virtually unheard of before people started putting cell phones near their ears. So we see tumors that are rather unusual, salivary gland tumors, acoustic neuromas, which are tumors in the nerves of the ear. And we see increased glioblastoma, gliomas, brain cancer. In fact, the World Health Organization has made a formal statement about that increased risk for both glioma, which is cancer of the brain, and the acoustic neuroma, cancer of the nerves going to the ear. Yet, we've only had popular and widespread use of cell phones for about 10 years. And it's really not a sufficient amount of time for cancers to appear. A lot of cancers take 20 to 25 years of exposure, and then they show up. So I would say that we don't have a sufficient amount of time yet to know the full ramifications of chronic disease development from use of these devices. And then we have increasing exposure because now I would say more and more apps are on the cell phones. People are spending more time on these devices. Entire regions like San Francisco boast about having Wi-Fi everywhere. There are increasing cell phone towers going up all over the place, even though one would think by now the market is saturated in our country. And wireless modems including industrial strength ones in our schools and workplaces, which are a little bit stronger than the home modems, and the digital communication phones that are wireless that are used in our homes also are strong emitters of these same frequencies in megahertz and gigahertz. So we have a plethora of other devices besides cell phone radiation causing havoc with our biology, potentially. And new generation phones that I've measured actually emit even more radiation than the older generation phones. And that's not going away anytime soon, because as the larger phones come out, they tend to be stronger emitters, and then the industry works and tells the government we need to push that limit up a little bit more, the SAR value, because everybody wants more bandwidth, faster communications, et cetera. So it's largely what the industry tells our government to do. And the government is not so responsive to the people and what they want as they are to the industry, who's calling the shots in this whole field. We need to take that back. So, as I said, the World Health Organization designated cell phone radiation as a possible human carcinogen. It's called a Class 2B, and it rates up there with substances, for example, such as caffeine. Now, how many of you have ever really read the manual that comes with your cell phone, or that should come with your cell phone, I should say, because only in the city of Berkeley, it's the only city I know where if you buy a cell phone in Berkeley, California, you will get a manual that comes with your phone. Berkeley made a law mandating that because they wanted people to know how to use their cell phones. And most people don't realize that the instruction manual says, keep the cell phone when it's in active mode communicating with the cell phone tower at least an inch from your body. Do not hold the device. Do not put it on your body or near your ear. It should be at least 1 inch away for safety's sake because of the radiation coming out of it. So interestingly, most people do not do this. They are talking with cell phones on the body, holding cell phones, working with them in active mode. And it's very important, this 1 inch. Why? Because the electric field strength, the strength of these frequencies goes down with distance according to 1 divided by the distance squared, or this kind of hyperbola relationship. So moving away just 1 inch from the cell phone will diminish the intensity of the cell phone radiation that's touching the body, especially the vital tissues such as brain or heart or gonads with cell phones in pockets, will diminish that strength enormously. And people need to be aware that it's not a good idea to keep the cell phones on their body or to talk with them like this. So we have a new syndrome. It's called electrohypersensitivity syndrome, as named by the World Health Organization. They estimated back in 2011 that some 3 to 6% of the world population is suffering from this. And in a serious way, where they actually had to make lifestyle changes, maybe leaving a workplace that has Wi-Fi and not using a cell phone. What are the symptoms? Well, there's a host, or quite a wide range of symptoms, and one may or may not have all of these, but maybe some of them. Headaches, anxiety, mood disorders, irritability, restlessness, problems with sleep, including trying to get to sleep as well as waking up in the night, difficulty concentrating, tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, heart palpitations, irregular heartbeats, and fatigue are some of the symptoms. Many people have these symptoms in our society, and I don't think they necessarily associate them with exposure, and nor do our physicians. Instead, people are medicating for these conditions, taking pharmaceutical drugs, rather than looking at what is it in their lifestyle that may be promoting the problem and reducing the problem, using what I would call prudent avoidance. In other words, yes, I'm not giving up my cell phone. It's a useful device. I need it for certain things, texting, GPS, phone calls that I really need to take in the moment. But I'm not going to do my email on my cell phone. I'm not going to play games in active mode. I'm not going to have it on all of the time in active mode, especially when it's tucked away in a pocket. So prudent avoidance is really one good way to take this into your own hands for what I'm saying today. Now, I'd like to tell you about my study. I did a study on cell phone radiation. It was a pilot study with 10 persons, and it was a study to look at the effects of short-term exposure between 45 minutes and about an hour and a half from either wearing a cell phone on the body and or using a cell phone in the active mode. And those are typical periods of exposure, which people might get on a daily basis. Actually rather conservative. Most people use a cell phone for much longer periods as I interviewed them. So my research questions were as follows. Does the blood, as seen under a dark field microscope, and this was blood taken from subjects that were exposed to the cell phone radiation, does it change after subjects are exposed to a smartphone for a short time period? Does consuming a certain diet, named after Weston A. Price, a diet of our ancestors, which I'll describe in a moment, does it help protect the blood from the effects of the cell phone radiation? And third question, is there any effect on the human biofield, the human energy field, from short-term exposure to cell phone radiation? My study was an exploratory pilot study of short duration, no control group. I took 10 adults who came one at a time by appointments. They were healthy adults, no chronic diseases, no medications, and eating various levels of the Weston A. Price recommended diet. And this was done in a laboratory under controlled conditions, so the same smartphone was used, the same amount of minutes of exposure. There was no Wi-Fi in this room, at least not used in our laboratory. And they wore the cell phone in a backpack that I gave them. The phone was turned on, ready to receive a text or phone call. They wore it for 45 minutes in a backpack. And then after that, we measured their blood again. And finally, they actively used the phone, holding it in one hand and using it in part to go on the internet, in part to make a phone call to me. I was on a landline. And I photographed using a dark field microscope and camera, attached camera, peripheral blood taken from the finger or toe to take a look at it under the 3 conditions of baseline, after wearing the phone in a backpack and after using the phone for an additional 45 minutes. The biofield was assessed with the BioWell device, which I'll describe later. So the subjects were 10, and they varied in age between 27 and 75 years old, with a mean age of 53. There were 8 women and 2 men. 8 out of 10 had their own personal cell phone. 6 out of 8 used a smartphone. 2 of them did not own or use a cell phone. So actually, these are pretty average demographics for the United States in this year. Daily use on their own was between 0 and 3.5 hours per day, with a mean of about 1.2 hours per day. Overall use, 0 to 20 years, with a mean of about 10 years. Most of them were members of the Weston A. Price Foundation, consuming this diet to varying degrees. And one of the reasons I selected the Weston A. Price Foundation members is because I had done previous studies, and I knew that the blood of these people eating that diet looked particularly good. I wanted blood that was good looking for starters, because I wondered whether blood was going to change and look worse as a result of the cell phone exposure. I wasn't sure, but it might be a reasonable hypothesis. Again, it's an exploratory study. I had no reason to believe that blood would look worse, but I didn't expect blood to look any better. So hence, I selected these people with good-looking blood. And this is the Weston A. Price recommended diet. Unrefined olive oil, but other than that, no liquid refined oils. Certainly no canola oil, which is causing a lot of inflammation in our diets. No refined sugars, no corn syrup, very little or no pastured milk, raw milk and raw cheese, free-range eggs, grass-fed animal meat, that is from pastured animals, wild fish, organic vegetables and fruits, grains and nuts soaked overnight so that they're sprouted to remove the phytic acid and the other biochemicals in grains that do not want to be consumed by mammals, protecting their integrity. A lot of saturated fat, between 3 and 15 tablespoons in the form of lard, butter, tallow, and coconut oil. And in the case of the animal fats from pastured animals not eating corn and soy, but eating their natural herbs and grasses. And mostly homemade meals with little conventional restaurant food, because you simply can't find this healthy diet in most restaurants. Cod liver oil supplementation and drinking fermented beverages such as kombucha and kefirs, and foods such as sauerkrauts and natural yogurt. So that's their diet. And the diet was followed to varying degrees from 20 to 98% among those subjects. Subjects were brought into the laboratory by appointment one a day or two a day, and they were refraining from using their own cell phone for 4 hours before they came, because I wanted to see them in a clean condition, not exposed to the cell phone radiation. They also had to come in fasted, because the blood, I don't want to see a lot of fat in the blood initially. And so they were 5 hours fasted, and I measured their blood, photographing it, again, a finger prick of blood taken at baseline, immediately when they entered the laboratory, and then after wearing the cell phone in a backpack for 45 minutes, the carrying condition, as I called it, and then after 45 minutes of active use of the phone, holding it in the hand and working with it, the active use condition. The active use condition included speakerphone calls to me, the researcher, on a landline, and they had 2 5-minute periods where they held the phone to the head. Just 2 5-minute periods among the 45 minutes. And let's see what happened. To say a few words about blood microscopy, I use a dark field blood strategy, taking peripheral blood, just a few microliters from the fingertip or toe, and I score the blood. I'm very familiar with this. I've done this testing for some 20 years using a Likert scale, which is eyeballing it and judging the degree of certain variables in the blood, where an assignment of 0 means something is not present and 6 is the highest value. The red blood elements that were scored included whether the cells were sticking together, what's called aggregation, whether they stuck together in little chains called rouleaux, or literally rolls, changes in shape of the cells, integrity of the cells, size variations, ghosting, breaking of the membranes, the white blood cell morphology, the types, the movement of white blood cells, their aggregation, the plasma, how clean it is, what bodies are present in the plasma, and finally, especially the red blood cell scores were most important in this study. I didn't really find changes in the other parameters so much as I did in red blood cell aggregation and red blood cell shape changes, as you'll see. So, there's many other things that one could see with this type of test, including even toxins in the plasma, hair coloring, if it's done recently, parasites that show up in the blood. It's really quite a versatile test, although not used in conventional medicine at this time. It was in prior times, although it's still used to look for the syphilis organism and the Lyme organism, dark field blood analysis. But it's still a useful marker, and it's used a lot in holistic health evaluations. There's the setup. So there's a microscope attached to a camera, and then a computer, and on the screen there are the blood. And the blood is lit from the sides with dark field microscopy, and there's the finger sampling with a standard sterile lancet. The finger is pricked, and a very small blood sample is placed on a glass slide covered with a cover slip, and then under the microscope. This is ideally how blood looks. Very clean, healthy blood from a Weston A Price Foundation member who eats about 98% of the diet regularly, and you can see that in this blood. The blood cells are uniform in shape and size. There's really no debris in the plasma, the space between the blood cells, and the plasma is clean. The cells are well formed and separated from each other, indicating that they have a high zeta potential, a high membrane charge that keeps them separated because like charges repel. So this is healthy blood. Extremely rare in our society, I might add. Here's another picture of blood from a little bit of an older person. There's a little bit of debris in that plasma, a little bit of platelet aggregates, those gray areas. And in the center there is a white blood cell, a polymorphonuclear leukocyte, on its way toward about 2 o'clock. I caught it in the act of moving. And the white blood cells move around the body like amoebas. They slowly move around, patrolling the body for abnormalities, viruses, bacteria, cancer cells, which they engulf and digest with those little vesicles that contain enzymes. So that's healthy blood. This is an example of what I see from many people who eat the conventional diet, not the Weston A Price diet, but who eat conventional diets, even organic. And a study I did back in 2008, where I compared the organic diet to the Weston A Price diet, many of the people eating organic food, their blood doesn't look that healthy. The red blood cells are stuck together in chains we call rouleaux, rolls, like a roll of nickels on edge. And that blood does not flow very well in the tiniest blood capillaries. It can't make it because the capillaries are actually narrower than the blood vessels, and the cells actually have to literally scrunch down to fit through those capillaries. This blood could not make it through those microcapillaries, and as a result, blood flow to the deepest tissues in all of our organs is compromised, including the brain, and as a result, fatigue, low energy, and we often say it's aging, but it's really just poor circulation because of blood that's compromised in its integrity. And let me show you the results. I'll just show you the results of the oldest persons in the studies because, as it turned out, age made a difference. The younger people showed effects, but the people 55 and up showed the strongest reactions to the cell phone radiation. So this is subject 1 at baseline, age 57, female, and the blood looks pretty good. The cells are separated, the plasma is fairly clean, a little bit of platelet aggregates, but nothing dramatic. This is the same subject in the post-carrying condition, and you start to see that the cells are now sticky in little heaps, aggregates as we call them. There are also some shape changes in those cells. So they went from perfectly round to membranes that are no longer perfectly round, somewhat misshapen, not completely circular anymore. And after using the phone, the blood looked somewhat worse. Now you see that the membranes are mostly misshapen. The round nature of the cells is gone in most of the cells. Let's take a look at the next subject. This is a female, age 55 at baseline. Already the blood is a little bit sticky. But after carrying the phone, the blood is much stickier. The blood is now, the red blood cells are in larger aggregates. There's almost no single red blood cell seen anymore after just carrying the phone in a backpack. And upon active use of the phone, the cells are extremely stuck together in rouleau. And again, it's rather dramatic. In addition, there's also some fibrin, some white threads in the plasma. So clotting has occurred very quickly in this blood. It shouldn't happen in this time frame. Now, the same subject was curious whether this was because I took the blood from the hand holding the cell phone, wondering, is this a result of what happens when you hold the cell phone in that hand and I take blood out of this finger? Well, maybe. But she donated toe blood. That's about as far as you can get from the hand. And indeed, the toe showed about the same profile. So it suggests that this is a systemic effect. It doesn't prove it, but it suggests that the blood effects from the cell phone radiation may be systemic. Third subject, a female, 75 years old at baseline. There's a little bit of stickiness in that blood, but essentially looks pretty good. And as people age, their blood does not look as good as younger people. Upon carrying the phone, this subject already had extremely sticky blood stuck together in rouleau and large clumps, as you can see here, just from having the cell phone worn in a backpack for 45 minutes. And after using the phone for an additional 45 minutes, the aggregates broke apart, but now take a look at these blood cells because you're going to see the membranes are completely different. Now, a single cell is completely circular anymore. They are all somewhat disheveled. And a great number of the cells have spikes. You can see them as, it looks like inclusions on the cells, but there are spiky prominences sticking out of the membranes of the cells. And this is a type of cell known in hematology. It's called an echinocyte, named after the echinoderm, like sea urchin, a spiky creature lives in the ocean. So when the red blood cells get spiky, they're called echinoderms, and in hematology, those cells show up in liver disease. They're not a healthy sign. The fourth subject, male, age 55. Initially, the blood looks pretty good, not so sticky. The plasma is fairly clean. And after carrying the cell phone, the blood shows much more stickiness in clumps. The red blood cells, you can look carefully and see that some of the membranes are no longer circular, but are changing shape, losing their integrity. And finally, after post-use, this subject showed 100% all echinocytes, all spiky red blood cells, indicating that the cell membranes were seriously damaged from the cell phone radiation. And yet was not the oldest subject in the study, but 55 years old. So the blood changes are rather dramatic. I did not expect to see such blood changes, and I frankly have never seen echinocytes at these levels before in any subjects in the 20 years that I've been doing research with blood microscopy. So these results were rather surprising to me. And as I said, I scored them, gave them numerical values for both aggregation as well as red blood cell shape changes using the Larkin scale. And I have done this for some 20 years, looking at blood in research. And then I added up and assigned a score to the aggregate value and to the shape change value, and plotted those scores versus, in this case, I'm plotting the percent of Weston A Price diet on the x-axis horizontally there, and the degree of blood aggregation in the red bars and the degree of red blood cell shape changes in the yellow bars with percent diet. And frankly, we do not see any protective effect here. As people eat more of the diet, moving toward the right, 98% of the diet, still considerable amount of aggregation in the blood and shape changes. So the diet alone is not protective of the blood when exposed to cell phone radiation. And after use condition, the previous one was just wearing the cell phone in the backpack. This is post-active use. Again, there was no clear relationship to the percent of Weston A Price diet. From 20% on the right-hand side to 98% on the left, the effects were across the board, no relationship to percent diet. So now let's see, we're looking at the carrying condition versus age here. The phone, with the cell phone exposure in the post-carrying condition. And here we see what suggests a difference in age, because the oldest subjects that were age, let's say in their 60s and 70s, showed the strongest effects of red blood cell aggregation compared to the younger persons. So it suggests it. It's a small study, so I can't make broad-scale conclusions, but this suggests an age effect. And also, this is blood aggregation scores, and shape changes too, after using the cell phone in active mode. And here we also see, going from the left-hand side, the younger people at age 27, and the older people up to 75 on the right, you can see distinctly that the people from the 50s on upward, the ones whose blood pictures I showed you, show the strongest blood aggregation as well as shape change effects. So age is a factor. And here is all subjects averaged for the two exposure conditions of carrying the phone and active use. So the red bar is on the left. The carrying condition produced more aggregation in the blood cells and less shape change in the blood cells. And the active use condition, the aggregation was also strong, but now the cell shape changes were more dramatic and much more significant over just wearing the cell phone. So we saw both types of changes. It appears that first the cells tend to aggregate together, and secondly, then they break apart and change shape as a result of cell phone radiation exposure. So 9 out of 10 subjects in my study had observable blood changes following the cell phone radiation exposure. And as I said, first the red blood cells aggregate in clumps or rouleaux, and then upon further exposure they break apart and the individual cells become misshapen and spiky. In the post-carrying condition, the red blood cell aggregates dominate, and in the post-use condition, the shape changes dominate. And the shape changes, I might say, are much more serious. I know that red blood cell aggregates are reversible, but I do not know if the echinocyte formation is reversible. And let's say a little bit about what's going on when red blood cells aggregate, because normal healthy red blood cells have a net negative charge on the outside of the membrane, and like charges repel. Those cells should be staying apart from one another because negative charges repel. But when cells come together, it suggests that they've lost their membrane potential, their zeta potential, and so something dramatic has happened to the cell membrane. That's what the results suggest. And even the shape change suggests that this is further advanced with more exposure to the cell. There's been some interesting papers in the literature talking about the possible mechanism of action of microwaves on cells. And one paper by Martin Paul examined evidence from many researchers who've written about results on cells. And he thinks that voltage-dependent calcium channels, this has to do with a mechanism for calcium to go inside and outside of the cell, that this particular channel for calcium opens up and allows more calcium to get in from the environment, that's what's going on with microwave radiation. And there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that Martin Paul may be correct. Now, changes in calcium inside the cell is a very important result biologically. Again, that goes along with these so-called non-thermal effects, because calcium is known to be a second messenger, a very important precursor to a host of biochemical changes regulated by calcium flux across membranes. So this is a very significant fact, and it may in fact be the mechanism of action, but further studies are needed to say so, to really investigate if that is the case. So, discussing my results, I have seen, because I've examined many people over many years, that red blood cell aggregates are quite common in the elderly in general. In sick persons and persons eating pro-inflammatory diets, and increasingly in our society as our nutrition is getting worse and not better on the average. The standard American diet is pretty sad, as the initials SAD tell us. It's not a healthy diet, and most people consuming such diet do not show healthy blood, but sticky blood and early clotting, signs of disseminated systemic inflammation, which is at the root of all chronic diseases: cancer, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, arthritis, etc. So when we see these changes in blood, we have to think generating chronic disease, and also increased cardiovascular risk in particular, because when we have red blood cells aggregating and early clotting occurring and increased blood viscosity as a result, it suggests increased cardiovascular risk, even from cell phone exposure. Now, of course, my study was short-term, and I'm only looking at very early effects of cell phone use, just 45 minutes to an hour and a half. I don't know what long-term effects there would be of hours of cell phone use. I also don't know how reversible the effects I observed are. How long would it take for these effects to disappear? People ask, did I do that in the study? And the answer is no, because my subjects were already fasted 5 hours when they arrived. They stayed 3 hours in the study to participate. They were pretty hungry at that point and needed to go. So I didn't study the aftermath of these changes. In fact, my study was just to explore, is there an effect? And now I know there is. And so future studies would look further to probe how long do these effects last, and what about further phone use, chronic exposure? There are so many questions. So I suspect that the shape changes in the red blood cells may be due to calcium influx into the cells, as Martin Paul's work suggests. But again, this is a speculation and needs to be studied. The spiky cells are certainly the most dangerous cells. They're known to be a pathological red blood cell type associated with diseases like cirrhosis of the liver, and not a healthy condition. And it's known that these echinocytes impair oxygen release in the tissues. So again, the blood could not do such a good job when sticky and also misshapen cells. And we don't know how long these changes last. That answer has to come from subsequent studies. So thinking further about my results, it was interesting to see that older persons showed greater blood changes than the younger subjects. And I'm not sure if this is due to the loss of resilience to a stressor with age, or whether it's because younger people have adapted to cell phone radiation because they use them more frequently, or some combination. I do not know. The study was a short-term study, a small one without a control group, without blinding. There were single sessions. It really was a preliminary study just to explore and look for an effect, which we did find. And yet there are a lot of good things about this study, that the fasting was identical, the laboratory setting, the exposure level, the periods, the identical phone being used, and the objective photography of the blood and the scoring by an experienced blood microscopist. So there were good and limited factors about the study that can be corrected in a subsequent one. The study was published in the journal Wise Traditions in Food Farming and the Healing Arts, volume 15, number 4, and you can download that from the internet. And a comment by the website electromagnetic.health.org. In a press release, they said that my study was the first study that they knew of that simply carrying a cell phone on the body in proximity to our tissues is sufficient to create disturbing changes in the body, in the blood. And the cell phone was not used. It was simply turned on in active mode. So I presented this study at a conference, the Bioelectromagnetic Society, and by and large, the industry was present there. And the industry holds the view that the only problem from cell phone radiation might be potential heating. And what did they say in consequence to my paper? For them, it wasn't important because it's not a new disease. Blood changes. They don't know what to make of it. So that was, in essence, the result. There's a small subset of people who do attend that conference who say, yes, there are non-thermal effects. We need to be looking at these, and we need to consider this in light of safety issues of these devices in our environment. So in the end, I say cell phone safety is still questionable. My study contributes one more piece of understanding to a growing body of literature that indicating possible health issues as a result of exposure. We need more studies by independent labs because studies by the industry with industrial funding do not show the same results as studies by independent third-party labs. And yet, it's very difficult to get funding to do those studies because the sources of the funding is simply not there. The government's not really funding this area, and it has to come from third parties, foundations, individual donors, etc. And now I'm beginning to use the methods that I developed in this initial study into looking at protective effects. What about all those devices on the market that people are buying and using, like little stickers they put on the rear of their cell phone, or pendants, or active resonators, or cases that may shield them from radiation? What about all those products? Show me the research. Very often the company selling the device has done a demo with one person, but they've not allowed a third-party laboratory to do a study, which is very unfortunate. Again, because studies coming from the industry are often biased. We cannot trust them as well as we should trust studies from independent parties. So we need more research funding. And these devices are these purported protective devices on the market that you stick on your cell phone or otherwise wear, in my opinion, are marketed without adequate study. I don't find peer-reviewed publications in the journals. the medical and scientific journals. I myself studied 6 devices thus far and found some of them didn't work at all in terms of protecting the blood. And I found some partial protection of blood changes that I found using some of those same subjects who were highly reactive to cell phone radiation. But I never found a 100% protective device yet. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means I haven't been able to do it. There's hundreds of devices out there being marketed as protective devices, and they need further study. One of my interests is looking at the energy field of the human body in relation to the exposure to these external fields, which are very different from our own natural biology and the Earth's natural frequencies. And I used a Russian camera called the BioWell, which measures finger by finger the biofield of the body. A person puts their finger into that black chamber, and this whole thing is hooked to a computer, and it's a form of electrophotography whereby the finger is touching an electrically charged glass plate and emitting a circle of light. That light is analyzed based on all 10 finger emissions, and calculations about the human biofield are then made. And I just want to show you one consequence. This was for the subject, 75-year-old subject. Left-right balance is greatly reduced after phone use. The subject held her phone in the left hand because she said she always takes notes with her right hand. That's how she holds her cell phone. And also to the left side of the head during the phone call, active use of the phone. So her baseline shows good left-right balance. That's the third bar graph there, 97%. And after active use of the phone for 45 minutes, the left-right balance of her energy field went down to 85%. So it shows that it's a negative effect. The left-right balance is diminished following holding a cell phone on one side of the body, which most people do. So I've come to the end of my talk. I'd like to acknowledge the help from my partner, Harry Jabs, a physicist. Dr. Andre Laszlo is professor of radiation biology at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Carl Merritt, who is a physician in the Santa Cruz area, also exploring these areas, and the Weston A Price Foundation in part funding this study. And finally, make an appeal for donations and foundations to continue to support our studies and other studies by third parties. We are a nonprofit 501c3 laboratory located in Emeryville, California, and we depend upon donations, gifts, and foundation grants in order to continue our work. And those are tax deductible to donors. So an appeal to those of you who might donate or who know of such foundations or individuals who might help us find a solution to this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beverly. Our program today is Wireless Devices, Health Dangers and Solutions with Dr. Beverly Rubik here on CMCM TV in Marin County. Do we have some audience questions here? Okay, hold on just a minute.
There's a move afoot on the part of the industry and governmental agencies now to eliminate landlines and switch the whole communication system to cell phones. What's your response to that?
Yes, I learned about this. We had a technician out to fix one of our phone lines, a landline, and he said by about the year 2020, every neighborhood will have no more landlines that are hardwired. There will be some kind of antenna in the neighborhood, and so you will really be using cell phone radiation to operate your landline. What was your landline? That's what's coming. Not only that, we have movements by consortiums of large companies that are going to put up satellites to make every portion of the Earth hooked up to the Wi-Fi. In other words, there will not be any place on Earth where you can stand and have a wireless radiation-free zone anymore. I'm quite disturbed about it because I do have many clients who have electrohypersensitivity syndrome, and I expect that more people are going to get this syndrome as we increase the exposure level. And there are many things you can do, and that's really a separate talk, we can talk about some of those measures that you can do to try to protect yourself. But once we bring more and more of this into our environment, our dosage goes up. We risk more biological effects. We risk cancer in the long run and more chronic diseases, I think, is what's coming. I think it's a very poor decision, and I don't see that the landlines are a problem. Now, all of this could go bye-bye. All of the Wi-Fi and all this use of radiation could be sidestepped if we move to fiber optics, which would be a very good way of conveying these signals instead of through radiation carried through the air. But I don't see that happening anytime soon because we don't have an infrastructure in place to do that. So I'm afraid we're stuck with an increased dosage as more and more technology and new generation phones come out. I mean, I recently learned when I was at the Bioelectromagnetic Society conference that the industry convinced the government that the ear is an appendage to the head and can take even more radiation. So we can expect future generations of our cell phones to be greater emitters as well. That's what's coming. And I think the public needs to be educated in this subject. We need to take our government back from its being literally controlled by big business and tell them what we want. We want safety standards, we want studies sponsored by the government, and we want to understand the relationship to chronic disease before we go any further with escalating these technologies.
Dr. Rubik, can you comment briefly on how we can protect ourselves right now?
Well, as I said earlier in my talk, one of the things is that we all need to exercise this prudent avoidance. In other words, let's use our cell phone when we need to, but let's not play games that involve active communications. Let's not use it for frivolous things. You don't really need to download your email on your cell phone. You can go home and do that on a computer hooked up to the old DSL cable Ethernet instead of Wi-Fi, which I recommend that you use. And if you do have Wi-Fi, turn it off at night. Put your Wi-Fi on a timer. It's so easy to do that so that when it's time to go to sleep, your home is Wi-Fi free. So we have to be concerned not just about cell phone radiation, but about all the sources of microwave radiation. Instead of using a wireless mouse and a wireless keyboard, use a wired mouse and a wired keyboard. People aren't running around with these wireless devices. You know, they usually sit at one station and operate their computer. So there's no need for a lot of these wireless devices in our lives. Let's use them when it's prudent and sensible. Let's eliminate Wi-Fi and the baby monitors. Did you know that in America we have very strong signals coming out of these baby monitors, big spikes? For developing infants, this is a terrible hazard. We have no idea what those effects will be on a developing brain and tissues. So, many simple procedures that we can do to separate ourselves from and lower our exposure.
Thank you for being here today. Our program today has been Wireless Devices, Health Dangers and Solutions with Dr. Beverly Rubik. I'm Kevin O'Malley. I'm chairman of the Business and Leadership Forum at the Commonwealth Club. It's been my pleasure to be here today as your guest moderator. Thank you all for joining us on CMCM TV and Marin. Thanks again. Bye-bye.